The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, described as Cladesberiana by Roman historians, took place in the Teutoburg Forest in 09 CE, when an alliance of Germanic tribes ambushed and decisively destroyed 3 Roman legions and their auxiliaries, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus. The anti-Roman alliance was led by Arminius, who had acquired Roman citizenship and received a Roman military education, thus enabling him to personally deceive the Roman commander and foresee the Roman army's tactical responses. Despite several successful campaigns and raids by the Roman army in the years after the battle, they never again attempted to conquer Germanic territory east of the Rhine River. The Germanic victory against the Roman legions in the Teutoburg Forest had far-reaching effects on the subsequent history of both the ancient Germanic peoples and on the Roman Empire. Modern historians have regarded Arminius' victory as Rome's greatest defeat, and one of the most decisive battles in history. Background: the Roman force was led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, a nobleman and experienced administrative official from a patrician family who was related to the imperial family. He was assigned to consolidate the new province of Germania in the autumn of 06 CE. Earlier that year, before Varus was commander on the Rhine, Legatus Gaius Sentius Saturninus and Consul Legatus Marcus Aemilius Lepidus led a massive army of 65,000 heavy infantry legionaries, 10,000–20,000 cavalrymen, archers, 10,000–20,000 civilians in an offensive operation against Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni, who were a tribe of the Suebi. Following their defeat at the hands of Drusus I in 09 BCE, they had fled into the territory of the Boia, from which they formed an alliance with the Hermundari, Quadi, Semnones, Lugians, Zumi, Butones, Mugilones, Sabini and Langobards. In 04 CE, Tiberius entered Germania and subjugated the Canonifates in Germania Inferior, the Chatti near the upper Weser River, and the Brucheri south of the Teutoburg Forest, before leading his army across the Weser. However, in 06 CE a rebellion broke out in the province of Illyricum, led by Bato the Daesitiate, Bato the Brutian, Pinus of Pannonia, and elements of the Marcomanni. It was known as the Bellum Batonianum, and it lasted nearly 4 years. Tiberius was forced to stop his campaign against Maroboduus and recognize him as king so that he could then send his 8 legions to crush the rebellion in the Balkans. All told, nearly half of all Roman legions in existence were sent to the Balkans to end the revolt, which was itself triggered by constant neglect, endemic food shortages, high taxes, and harsh behavior on the part of the Roman tax collectors. This campaign, led by Tiberius and Quaestor Legatus Germanicus under Emperor Augustus, was one of the most difficult, and most crucial, in the history of the Roman Empire. Due to this massive redeployment of available legions, when Varus was named Legatus Augusta Pro Praetor in Germania, only 3 legions were available to him. Varus' name and deeds were well known beyond the empire because of his ruthlessness and crucifixion of insurgents. While he was feared by the people, he was highly respected by the Roman Senate. On the Rhine, he was in command of the 17, 18, and 19 legions. These had previously been led by General Gaius Sentius Saturninus, who had been sent back to Rome after being awarded an Ornamenta Triumphalia. The other 2 legions in the winter quarters of the army at Castrum Moguntiacum were led by Varus' nephew, Lucius Nonius Asprinus and perhaps Lucius Aruncius. Following the attacks of Drusus I in 119 BCE, Varus' opponent, Arminius, along with his brother Flavus, had been sent to Rome as tribute by their father, Segimorus the Conqueror, chieftain of the noblest house in the tribe of the Cherish. Arminius then spent his youth in Rome as a hostage, where he had received a military education, and even been given the rank of equestrian. During Arminius' absence, Segimorus was declared a coward by the other Germanic chieftains, because he had submitted to Roman rule, a crime punishable by death under Germanic law. Between 11 BC and 04 CE, the hostility and suspicion between the Germanic tribes deepened. Trade and political accords between the warlords deteriorated. Tacitus wrote that the Chatti were hostile, and subjugated the Cherish, but were themselves pacified, between 4 and 06 CE. Velleius Paterculus also reported that in the years 1–4 CE, there was unrest in Germania. After his return from Rome, Arminius became a trusted advisor to Varus, but in secret he forged an alliance with Germanic tribes that had traditionally been enemies. These included the Cherish, Marsi, Chatti, Brucheri, Chaucer, Sicambray, and remaining elements of the Suebi, who had been defeated by Caesar in the Battle of Vosges. These 5 were some of the 50 Germanic tribes at the time. Using the collective outrage over Varus' tyrannous insolence and wanton cruelty to the conquered, Arminius was able to unite the disorganized tribes who had submitted in sullen hatred to the Roman dominion, and maintained said alliance until the most opportune moment to strike. While Varus was on his way from his summer camp west of the Weser River to winter headquarters near the Rhine, he heard reports of a local rebellion, reports which had been fabricated by Arminius. Edward Shepherd Creasy writes that this was represented to Varus as an occasion which required his prompt attendance at the spot, but he was kept in studied ignorance of its being part of a concerted national rising, and he still looked on Arminius as his submissive vassal. Varus decided to quell this uprising immediately, expediting his response by taking a detour through territory that was unfamiliar to the Romans. Arminius, who accompanied him, directed him along a route that would facilitate an ambush. Another Cheruscan nobleman, Segestes, brother of Segamarus and unwilling father-in-law to Arminius, warned Varus the night before the Roman forces departed, allegedly suggesting that Varus should apprehend Arminius, along with other Germanic leaders whom he identified as participants in the planned uprising. His warning, however, was dismissed as stemming from the personal feud between Segestes and Arminius. Arminius then left under the pretext of drumming up Germanic forces to support the Roman campaign. Once free from prying eyes, he immediately led his troops in a series of attacks on the surrounding Roman garrisons. Recent archaeological finds place the battle at Kalkriese Hill in Osnabrück County, Lower Saxony. On the basis of Roman accounts, the Romans were marching northwest from what is now the city of Detmold, passing east of Osnabrück after camping in the area. Prior to the attack, battles, Varus' forces included his 3 legions, 6 cohorts of auxiliary troops and 3 squadrons of cavalry. Most of these lacked combat experience, both with regard to Germanic fighters, and under the prevalent local conditions. The Roman forces were not marching in combat formation, and were interspersed with large numbers of camp followers. As they entered the forest northeast of Osnabrück, they found the track narrow and muddy. According to Dio Cassius, a violent storm had also arisen. He also writes that Varus neglected to send out reconnaissance parties ahead of the main body of troops. The line of march was now stretched out perilously long, between 15 and 20 kilometers. It was in this state when it came under attack by Germanic warriors armed with light swords, large lances and narrow-bladed short spears called frema. The attackers surrounded the entire Roman army, and rained down javelins on the intruders. Arminius, recalling his education in Rome, understood his enemy's tactics, and was able to direct his troops to counter them effectively by using locally superior numbers against the dispersed Roman legions. The Romans managed to set up a fortified night camp, and the next morning broke out into the open country north of the Wehen Hills, near the modern town of Osterkapelle. The breakout was accompanied by heavy losses to the Roman survivors, as was a further attempt to escape by marching through another forested area. As the torrential rains continued, the rain prevented them from using their bows because sinew strings become slack when wet. and rendered them virtually defenseless as their shields also became waterlogged. The Romans undertook a night march to escape, but marched into another trap that Arminius had set, at the foot of Calcresa Hill. There, a sandy, open strip on which the Romans could march was constricted by the hill, so that there was a gap of only about 100 meters between the woods and the swampland at the edge of the Great Bog. The road was further blocked by a trench, and, towards the forest, an earthen wall had been built along the roadside, permitting the Germanic tribesmen to attack the Romans from cover. The Romans made a desperate attempt to storm the wall, but failed, and the highest-ranking officer next to Varus, Legatus Numenius Valor, abandoned the troops by riding off with the cavalry. His retreat was in vain, however, as he was overtaken by the Germanic cavalry and killed shortly thereafter, according to Velleius Paterculus. The Germanic warriors then stormed the field and slaughtered the disintegrating Roman forces. Varus committed suicide, and Velleius reports that one commander, Praefectus Sionius, shamefully surrendered, then later took his own life, while his colleague Praefectus Egeus heroically died leading his doomed troops. Roman casualties have been estimated at 15,000–20,000 dead, and many of the officers were said to have taken their own lives by falling on their swords in the approved manner. Tacitus wrote that many officers were sacrificed by the Germanic forces as part of their indigenous religious ceremonies, cooked in pots and their bones used for rituals. Others were ransomed, and some common soldiers appear to have been enslaved. All Roman accounts stress the completeness of the Roman defeat. The finds at Calcresa are of 6,000 pieces of Roman equipment, but only one single item, part of a spur, that is clearly Germanic, indicate minimal Germanic losses. However, the victors would most likely have removed the bodies of their fallen, and the practice of burying their warriors' battle gear with them would have also contributed to the lack of Germanic relics. Additionally, several thousand Germanic soldiers were deserting militiamen who wore Roman armor, and would thus appear to be Roman in the archaeological digs. It is also known that the Germanic tribes wore less metal, and more perishable organic material, such as leather. The victory was followed by a clean sweep of all Roman forts, garrisons and cities, of which there were at least 2, east of the Rhine. The remaining 2 Roman legions in Germania, commanded by Varus' nephew Lucius Nonius Asprenas, were content to try to hold that river. One fort, Aliso, most likely located in today's Halton am See, fended off the Germanic tribes for many weeks, perhaps even a few months. After the situation became untenable, the garrison under Lucius Decius, accompanied by survivors of Teutoburg forest, broke through the siege, and reached the Rhine. Aftermath. Upon hearing of the defeat, the Emperor Augustus, according to the Roman historian Suetonius in De Vita Caesarum, was so shaken that he stood butting his head against the walls of his palace, repeatedly shouting, Quintili Viri, Legionis Reda. The legion numbers 17 and 19 were not used again by the Romans. Unlike other legions that were restructured, unique in Roman history, except for the 22 Dietariana legion, which may have been disbanded after heavy losses against the Jewish rebels in the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea. The battle abruptly ended the period of triumphant Roman expansion that followed the end of the civil wars 40 years earlier. Augustus steps and Tiberius took effective control, and prepared for the continuation of the war. Legio II Augusta, XX Valeria Victrix, and 13 Gemina were sent to the Rhine to replace the lost legions. Arminius sent Varus' severed head to Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, the other most powerful Germanic ruler, with the offer of an anti-Roman alliance. Maroboduus declined, sending the head to Rome for burial, and remained neutral throughout the ensuing war. Only thereafter did a brief, inconclusive war break out between the 2 Germanic leaders. Roman retaliation. Germanicus. A campaign against the Germans. Though the shock at the slaughter was enormous, the Romans immediately began a slow, systematic process of preparing for the reconquest of the country. In 14 CE, just after Augustus' death and the accession of his heir and stepson Tiberius, a massive raid was conducted by the new emperor's nephew Germanicus. He attacked the Marsi in a surprise attack. The Brucheri, Tubantai, and Userpeta were roused by the attack and ambushed Germanicus on the way to the winter quarters, but were defeated with heavy losses. In spring 15 CE, Legatus Caecina Severus invaded the Marsi a second time with about 25,000–30,000 men, causing great havoc. Meanwhile, Germanicus' troops had built a fort on Mount Taunus, from where he marched with about 30,000–35,000 men against the Chatti. Many of the men fled across a river and dispersed themselves in the forests. Germanicus next marched on Mattium and burned it to the ground. After initial successful skirmishes in summer 15 CE, including the capture of Arminius, a wife thus Nelda, the army visited the site of the first battle. According to Tacitus, they found heaps of bleached bones and severed skulls nailed to trees, which they buried, looking on all as kinsfolk and of their own blood. Under Germanicus, the Romans marched another army, along with allied Germanic auxiliaries, into Germania in 16 CE. He forced a crossing of the Weser near modern Minden, suffering some losses to a Germanic skirmishing force, and forced Arminius' army to stand in open battle at Idistavasa in the Battle of the Weser River. Germanicus' legions inflicted huge casualties on the Germanic armies while sustaining only minor losses. A final battle was fought at the Angevarian Wall west of modern Hanover, repeating the pattern of high Germanic fatalities, which forced him to flee. In summer 16 CE, Caecilius marched against the Chatting with 33,000 men. Germanicus invaded the Marsi a third time and devastated their land. With his main objectives reached and winter approaching, Germanicus ordered his army back to their winter camps, with the fleet incurring some damage from a storm in the North Sea. After a few more raids across the Rhine, which resulted in the recovery of 2 of the 3 legions Eagles lost in 09 CE, Tiberius ordered the Roman forces to halt and withdraw across the Rhine. Germanicus was recalled to Rome and informed by Tiberius that he would be given a triumph and reassigned to a new command. Campaigns of Germanicus and A. Caecina Severus in the years 14–16 CE. Military action in 14 CE. Campaigns in 15 CE. Operations in 16 CE. Germanicus. A campaign had been taken to avenge the Teutoburg slaughter and also partially in reaction to indications of mutinous intent amongst his troops. Arminius, who had been considered a very real threat to stability by Rome, was now defeated. Once his allied Germanic coalition had been broken and honor avenged, the huge cost and risk of keeping the Roman army operating beyond the Rhine was not worth any likely benefit to be gained. Later campaigns. The 3rd legionary standard was recovered in 41 CE by Publius Gabinius from the Chaucer during the reign of Claudius, brother of Germanicus, according to Cassius Dio in Roman History Book Lux, Book 60, Chapter 8. Possibly the recovered aquilae were placed within the Temple of Mars Alta, the ruins of which stand today in the Forum of Augustus by the Via Dei Fori Imperiali in Rome. The last chapter was recounted by the historian Tacitus. Around 50 CE, bands of Chatti invaded Roman territory in Germania Superior, possibly an area in Hesse east of the Rhine that the Romans appear to have still held, and began to plunder. The Roman commander, Publius Pomponius Secundus, and a legionary force supported by Roman cavalry recruited auxiliaries from the Vangiones and Nemites. They attacked the Chatti from both sides and defeated them, and joyfully found and liberated Roman prisoners, including some from Varus legions who had been held for 40 years. Impact on Roman expansion. From the time of the rediscovery of Roman sources in the 15th century, Teutoburg Forest has been seen as a pivotal clash, which ended Roman expansion into northern Europe. This notion became especially prevalent in the 19th century, where it formed an integral part of the mythology of German nationalism. More recently, some scholars have begun to question this interpretation and have pointed out reasons why the Rhine was a much more practical boundary for the Roman Empire than any other river in Germania. Logistically, armies on the Rhine could be supplied from the Mediterranean via the Rhone, Saône and Moselle, with a brief stretch of portage. Armies on the Elbe, on the other hand, would have to have been supplied either by extensive overland routes or ships traveling the hazardous Atlantic seas. Economically, the Rhine was already supporting towns and sizable villages at the time of the Gallic conquest. Northern Germania was far less developed, possessed fewer villages, and had little food surplus and thus a far lesser capacity for tribute. Thus the Rhine was both significantly more accessible from Rome and better equipped to supply sizable garrisons than the regions beyond, and there were also practical reasons to fall back from the limits of Augustus expansionism in this region. Nonetheless, the Severan-era historian Cassius Dio is emphatic that Varus had been conducting the latter stages of full colonization of a greater German province, which has been partially confirmed by recent archaeological discoveries such as the Varian-era Roman provincial settlement at Waldgirmus Forum. There were several later Roman punitive campaigns after that of Germanicus east of the Rhine River into Germania Magna. One of them, led by the Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax, resulted in a Roman victory in 235 CE at the Battle at the Hartshorn Hill, which is located in the modern German state of Lower Saxony, east of the Weser River, between the towns of Kalefeld and Bad Gandersheim. After Arminius was defeated and dead, Rome tried to control Germania east of the Rhine and north of the Danube indirectly, by appointing client kings. Italicus, a nephew of Arminius, was appointed king of the Cherish, and Vangio and Cedo became vassal princes of the powerful Suebi.